This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. Just while I've been thinking about this video, where I'm going to talk to you about combinations that I think might be a good place to start, I think the Fender FR12 is going to be an important part of this video. But one thing that I'm going to say later on is that the experience of using a modeler in general is quite similar across most of them. And to get a sense of this, the Boss IR2 is a relatively inexpensive way into this. And I just decided, right, let's just plug this into the ToneMaster FR12 and see what happens. And to me, this is the sort of experience that I would have wanted to have early on with modelling, really, but you don't generally get this sort of thing, right? Switch channels. I think the thing is really, actually, with normal kind of modelling setups, it's going to take you a while to get to this sort of stage where you're just playing, and what you'll find is that it's going to really depend what speaker you're plugging through, and if you switch between speakers, you're going to get a massively variable experience. So that's why I'm thinking, like, starting with the FR12 as something like that actually is really tweakable, plug and play pretty good, might be the best bet. Which I thought I should probably put this in, given that I've just tried this and had a good experience. I wanted to make this video because I think there might be some people who will find it who are thinking about switching over to modelling. You're hearing more and more people possibly talk about it than ever before, people making the switch and that sort of stuff. Or you might be someone like me who's been in it for a while, you know, since probably mid-2000s. I've been using Line 6 gear and probably played most of the top modelers, if you want to call them that. Yeah, so I think that's kind of my background on this. Maybe you're struggling with various things and all that sort of stuff. So I think you're not alone. So the first thing to say is that if you're thinking about making the switch, in general, just like with real amps and stuff like that, there isn't too much of a plug and play option. Now, to be fair, with some amplifiers, once you find the one that's right for you, they can be plug and play. But what I mean is, if you think about the amps that you might have owned over the years, for some of you, it might be something like a Fender Princeton really works well for you, but something like a Vox AC30 maybe wouldn't, or however you want to think about this. Or maybe you're a guy who uses a channel switching Mesa Boogie amplifier, in which case, if I set you up in a practice room with a Marshall DSL or, some other type of amp, how would you react with that? And I think that is probably reasonable to think that actually the modelling world, we have loads of choice, and it's tempting to go through and make lots of choices and try different things, but the reality is that there's a lot of amplifiers out there that you might plug into that wouldn't do the thing that you want. So that's not necessarily a modelling thing that you're butting up against there in some ways. It could just be that the things that you're trying in real life you wouldn't love either. And that's another point as well. This is something else that I see folks maybe struggling with. Like the amps that are modelled, whether it's in Line 6 or whatever. I've seen it a little bit in the Fractal world as well with the Bob Bradshaw rack unit. Some of the time we're kind of going off our memory of what gear sounded like. And I think that's actually a really... although it's all we've got in some cases, I think it's really easy to forget the times that we spent with various pieces of gear where they didn't sound quite right, weren't quite doing what we were looking for. And that's just something to remember again. That, as well, the modelling stuff, I don't know, this one thing that I read, well, this doesn't sound like my Marshall whatever. Do you really remember what that amp sounded like, or you kind of got rose-tinted speculums on to some extent? So that's the thing I have. When I've actually A-B'd amps with the modelling versions, whether it's in Fractal or Line 6, or with a Kemper or Quad Cortex capture, they're really pretty close, and close enough that when you're really like looking back and checking through recordings, I think you'd be hard pushed to tell the difference. Probably something else that's different. Now, one thing to bear in mind with this modelling stuff is that if you're going to make the leap, you think, all right, I just buy this one piece of gear and I'm kind of set. And actually, the modelling game is not quite like that. So what I would encourage you to think about is, instead of spending £1,500 on like the flagship thing, because what I find is that actually the experience of using a modeler in general, they're actually quite similar and have some same kind of differences to the experience of using a real amp, in that if I was to use a Helix or a Hotone Ampero or Quad Cortex, those would be kind of more similar in experience to actually just plugging into a real amplifier, if you get what I mean. So to test the waters, I might actually recommend something more down the line of like a Universal Audio Ruby or Dream 65, or one of those pedals that actually matches something that you use in real life already, or like an HX Stomp, because I think, well, to me it makes more sense to try those kind of things first and see if they work for you before going down the route of getting into a full kind of computer based kind of digital modeling rig that is way different to what you're using right now. So obviously the Quad Cortex and the Fender Tone Master Pro are the things that I'm thinking about here, where there was significant marketing push behind them, and people that had never tried modeling before jumped on those and gave those a go. I actually think you could spend about 3 times less than that and get roughly a pretty good idea about whether digital modeling is going to work for you or not. And the thing that actually could make or break it, I think, is buying a speaker that is going to work for you, or getting into this kind of thing, which is another point as well. Not only are you going to be down the rabbit hole of comparing sort of modelers with one another, and if you own one modeler, I presume you're probably going to end up owning several more, because it's kind of a thing where you just jump from like the pedal world into the modeling world. It doesn't mean that you suddenly stop getting gas for the latest greatest modeler and stuff like that. But yes, the first thing that I think a lot of people will go for will be like a head rush thing, which is essentially a repurposed PA speaker. What I would encourage you to do is maybe skip that step and go for a Fender FR12. As someone who's tried Power Cab, I've got a limited time in a room with a Laney LFR. I've tried normal PA speakers, whether they're Yamaha DXR15s and stuff like that. And if you're trying to get that experience that things that sounded good when you were tweaking at home sound good into the speaker that you're going to turn it up, and you want it to sound kind of like your stuff sounded at home but louder and kind of give you that amp feel, then the Fender FR12 is the closest thing that I've found that does that. That's what I had blasting behind me. I'll show you some camera audio. But a lot of the other units that I've tried require some amount of tweaking, and maybe because of construction and maybe elements like that, they're actually a bit closer to a PA speaker anyway. Yeah, to me it seems like you're fighting the elements of what that speaker naturally wants to sound like versus this, which is kind of actually just built like a guitar cab. So I think that's one thing that Fender got really right with the FR12. They're not hugely expensive, so something like an HX Stomp and an FR12 I think might be a good starting point if you're thinking about getting into modelling. That would be about £1,000. So that's something else to bear in mind, that the costs of these things are not insubstantial, and yes, they might be cheaper than some really expensive amplifiers, but I think it's probably fair to say that you might be looking at, you know, £1,000 if you really want to get into the digital modelling rig and use it live. Something like an HX Stomp, £1,000 maybe kind of the starting point if you have a speaker involved as well. And then if you go to the flagship modelling stuff, which I guess some of the benefits are more complex signal chains and more processing power, then you're really looking at £2,000 to £3,000 maybe, or 1.5 to 2.5. The footprint of a modeler, I think that's one of the things that we think about being better and more portable and all that sort of stuff. This is something that I did see someone commenting on a friend's post the other day, like I think they were talking about getting 2 Fender FR12s, and you think, well, actually by the time you've got like your modeler on the floor, and if you want stereo kind of speakerage, which some people do, and I think probably it does sound great for that sort of thing, right? 2 of these FR12 speakers, which I think are about 12 kilos or something like that, 12 to 14 kilos. So that's 2 cabs, modeler as well. You know, you think that is starting to get not that far away from what a traditional amp rig might be. And that for me was partly why I did sort of go back to just using a cab and a head, because I was thinking, well, to get this thing sounding good with my PA system, or to get it feeling good, I'm still taking a cab, I'm still taking a head of some form, or a power cab or whatever, or an FR12 at this point. Why wouldn't I just take a valve amp instead and, you know, have the perceived benefits of that? The other thing is that a valve amp, I think, generally is quite a lot louder in my experience than these FR12 type things, or speakers want to be like a power cab. You really have to push the input quite hard to get those at a good kind of stage volume. Whereas, you know, on this matchless clone, the master, I barely have it like 2 or 3, and it's still really punchy, really loud. I think there is an element with the modelling stuff of, probably is a good thing for stage volume, but part of why I think maybe people don't have a great experience is that their own sound reinforcement stuff, whether it's a headrush speaker or something like that, is actually not quite as loud as a tube amp, which are fantastically loud, and I think that's part of why they feel so good. Those are kind of some thoughts for me. So, like, it is another rabbit hole, and maybe you won't be building pedal boards, but you will sink a lot of time into actually building presets, is probably what you might find, unless it happens that you like my presets or something like that, which does save some people a little bit of time, I think. Hopefully, we can let people know in the comments if that is you. But the fantastic thing about modelling for me, the main thing that I really love it for is home recording. And I would not be without it for home recording. I find it actually way more convenient for recording at home. I've done videos on that. And modelling for me is absolutely the key to my workflow at home. Using it live stuff, which I think is a thing that maybe a bunch of you don't want to gig these things.
I think that is something I focused on, but I do hear from some of you guys that that's not a thing that you're interested in. But if I was just playing at home, then the modelling is a total no-brainer thing for me, like an HX Stomp, a Fractal FM3, the Hotone stage is really cool as well. There's loads of great options for that sort of stuff, but I think it's still a rabbit hole. But for me, like just plugging into, that's a Bassman amp style that I was using in intro there. I really enjoy playing with these sorts of things. I really love the delay and the reverbs on these sorts of things. I think, yeah, there's lots of really positive things. The only real negatives for me is that there's sometimes these additional costs that come with it, and that you spend time building presets at home, and then when you come to use them live, it can sometimes be a bit tricky. So in that case, what I really recommend getting au fait with doing, who's Faye, is setting high cuts aggressively for live use. Essentially is what has been the only thing that has worked well for me live. So on my presets, when I'm going to be using them live, I'm setting my high cut in the cab section down to 4K. That's a 6 dB per octave slope, but 4K, and that tends to give you that feeling of being kind of off axis from a speaker, not so direct up front to it. This is something that the Boss Waza Airs gets really right as well, actually. That roll off that you get because you're not standing right next to a speaker versus a mic which is right on the speaker. I think that's one of the huge differences that we have, as well as like a real guitar amp just fills the space, or can do, like loads of bass, loads of sound going everywhere, versus a modeler which might be coming out of your PA speakers with loads of other sound coming through it, like singers and keyboards and stuff, and it might be coming through a bit of stage volume behind you or in front of you, which is another weird thing to get a hold of. But lots of things to think about. There is no magic bullet to this, I don't think, but I would spend a little bit of money to start, maybe thinking about the yeah, Universal Audio stuff is a good kind of thin end of the wedge way in, and you can combine that with your existing pedals and stuff like that as well, before you go all the way in and think, right, do I need to spend £1,500, £2,000 on a modeler to get into this? That's kind of my opinion on it. Anyway, let me know if you've got different opinions. I think some things I think is worth thinking about, that there is definitely more costs than meet the eye with this stuff, and a lot of time goes into it, I think, before you start to get really good results. And sometimes even then you're going to still be thinking like, well, I think I sounded better before with my tube amp. Whether you did or not is maybe a different thing, but if you're thinking you did, then you're kind of then back to square one where you're not happy with your tone again. So it's a whole cycle. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts on that.